welcome first of all to the first in this series of Where on Earth Do We Go From Here webinars from Tricordon. I'm Alistair, I'm one of the directors, and on my call, this call you've got a number of colleagues, Nick, Roger, John, Graham, who you may well bump into as we go through the call. It's great that you can join us. Today we're going to focus on recovery and resilience. We, as a company like everybody, thought, how can we offer to help both clients and other people in these rather strange and unusual times that we find ourselves in? So we decided that we'd put together a webinar series. And if we're honest, like lots of people, we are learning as we go along. So we're going to be seeking feedback at the end, be sending a survey out afterwards. So if we're not as 100% slick as you think we might be, there's a good reason why. We've designed the webinar to mix between being all together like this, and there'll be a small sharing from one of us, and then we're going to give you a decent chunk of time in small breakout rooms to introduce each other, get to know each other, and talk about some key issues. We'd like some kind of brief feedback from that, and then we will kind of move on. We are recording today as well, and as Nick mentioned at the beginning, there will be an opportunity to answer a couple of polls as we go along as well. So I hope that is in line with what you were expecting. Just thought it would be helpful if we kick off just to share a couple of ground rules. We find these are really helpful when you're in a yeah, indeed, thank you. When you're in a virtual space, to try and get the ground rules so we can get the best out of the time that we've got together. So thought you might be interested just to see who's in the call. Not sure if everybody who registered has turned up, such is the nature of these things. But interestingly, we've got a really broad range of people from central government departments, from healthcare, various parts of healthcare, from the not-for-profit sector, but also pharma, financial services, education, etc. So a really good mix of people, which is great.
You wanted, didn't you?
Some ground rules. One of them is when you're not talking, could you mute yourself? That will be really helpful so we don't get background noise. And then when you want to talk, it's great. You can unmute yourself. You can raise your hand. That would be great. If you're able to have video, ironing, washing, children going mad in the background, notwithstanding, that's always great. We sure, particularly when you get into the small groups, the video will help. Being able to see each other, understand the questions, get to know people, that's great. And be curious, as we always say, about what's different about people's different experiences. I'm very aware that on this call, there will be a very wide range of experiences to what people are experiencing, from people who are working alongside people who are right up close in the front line. I was talking to a colleague yesterday about her husband's an A&E consultant at a local hospital, and he actually works on the interface between A&E and intensive care. And when we were talking, I said, "Oh, worst case scenario, is he isolated from you?" And he said, "Worst case scenario is he dies, because he's so exposed." And it kind of brought home, my goodness, there are people in that space, through to people who are home working and not used to home working, and life is very disruptive, but you've got everything in between. So let's be curious about our differences. It'd be great if you can follow the process we're suggesting. We're also requesting that we treat this as Chatham House. We can talk about the themes that come out, but please don't say, "Oh, you know, Julia was there," and you never guess what Julia said. It's usually very wise, and I'm sure if you ask her, she'll let you tell people, but you know. We are going to record the main plenary sessions, but not the individual breakout room sessions, and we're proposing to make the recording available to people who have signed up for the webinar series. I've had at least one person who said, I'm actually got COVID-19 at the moment, I'm recovering, I'd love to join next time, but I'm not well enough yet. And we'd also love you to continue the conversation at the LinkedIn site, and we'll publish a reflection there as well. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the things that we think will be helpful in terms of how we work together. So I'm going to hand over in just a second to my colleague, Roger Green, who's just going to give you a very kind of initial response and view about kind of what might be going on for people at the moment.
What occurs to us is clearly we're experiencing unprecedented threat. And now, have you got control? Have I got control of these slides, Nick? Not running through. Ah, yeah, there it is. Okay. So we're curious about the way in which we're observing people responding, either in our general communities or indeed in wider organizations, and classically, the kind of thing that you look at on the news. And our fundamental response to threat is around this kind of fight, flight, or freeze. So we understand now the fundamental role of the brain is about ensuring the perpetuation of the species. And to achieve that, the brain does a couple of things. It either protects us from threats or it seeks reward. And in this case, it's clearly unprecedented threat. So we're just thinking a few moments about fight, flight, or freeze. And they are all natural reactions to danger. It's a stress response to a perceived threat. We see people, for example, on the news, some in tears under stress, some in kind of, yeah, we can do this, let's fight through. And they're very different responses, but they are expressions of, or they appear to be expressions of fight, flight, or freeze. And each of those responses instantly causes, hormonal and physical changes. Now, we're not going to touch on the physiological side of this today. I don't think, personally, not competent to do that, but it may be helpful at some point in the future to get people who are competent to help us with that kind of managing the physiological side of our responses. But essentially, it's about understanding it's a survival instinct developed through the ages. Freezing is fight or flight on hold, where we're having to get ready for the next move. And none of these reactions, fight, flight, or freeze, is a conscious decision. It's an automatic reaction. That's one of the kind of fundamental things, I think, to observe here. And our observation is that there are going to be people in our communities and our organizations who are in each of those fight, flight, or freeze response modes. And it might just be helpful to think about the kinds of response that you're observing in your organizations and communities, and what are the appropriate leadership responses to those groups. So if we think about those who are fighting, how do we take care of the fighters? Because fighters can potentially damage themselves by going in too hard and fast. My kind of limited experience of major incidents in the NHS was that lots of people would pour in at the very beginning, or want to pour in at the very beginning, and you had to hold them off because you got to keep that energy for later in the process. So there's something about how we respond to the fighters, and how we take care of them as leaders. There's something about how we deal with those who are, freezing, or they may be in denial, and they need some direction, particularly in circumstances of high risk or high threat. But there are also those who may be in flight and demonstrating or manifesting kind of significant psychological stress. And how do we look after those? I think one of the important observations out of all of this is that these are not good or bad people. They can all be good people, but because this is an automatic reaction in us, even good people will be experiencing flight and freeze, and they may be experiencing that because it's either self-protective or it's protective of their families, etc. But we just wanted to kind of insert that as a thought to provoke how we think about those people and how we lead those people, particularly how we relate to those people in our organization. So clearly we can't, segment them into three specific groups, but what we can do is be mindful that there will be a spread of those responses around our organization.
Thank you, Roger. So we'd like you now to, Nick's going to put you into some small chat rooms in Zoom, and we'd like you in those times, we're suggesting you've got 20 minutes. We're going to suggest that you, somebody takes on the role of just facilitating, somebody ready to report would be great. Obviously introduce yourselves, and we're interested in what experience you've had both individually and organizationally that's caught you by surprise, but what strategies are working well for you in dealing with this mixture of responses that Roger's just been describing. And it would be great if you could capture and perhaps put in chat for everybody to see the summarized feedback. But we'll give you time when we come back to hear from each chat room the sort of things that you were discussing. So that's great. Over to you, Nick, to put us into our rooms, please. Well, welcome back, everybody. It's good to have you back. I hope you had a chance to begin to get some conversations going there. And it would be good, Nick, how many breakout rooms did we end up with? 5. So I think it would be good to hear a little bit of highlights from each of the 5 breakout rooms. And we've got time for that. And if people can post it in chat as well, that would be great. There's 1 or 2 new faces as we've gone along joining us. Does a reporter from breakout room 1 want feedback? If you knew who you were. Otherwise, I will call out your names on here.
If you can make my picture turn up, I recorded a little bit of what people were talking about. So it's my screen, how you can make me bigger.
I'll let Nick, because he's in charge of tech today, see if he can do that. If you go to Speaker View, if everybody clicks on Speaker View, you'll get Ralph's picture coming up. And if only Ralph, if everyone else mutes, then Ralph's picture will come up. Over to you, Ralph.
Okay, thanks very much. So in breakout room 1, some of what I heard about catching people by surprise, which I've just tried to visualize. People were saying how much processes had been sped up because of how quickly things have happened. I think that was a positive outcome. People were also saying how suddenly they were feeling disconnected by a sudden difference of environment and process. That actually, because people were having to talk to each other, there was increased humanity and how positive that was. People were having sudden transitions and actually how quickly things have been mobilized. Those are a few of the things I heard, so I hope that's helpful.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Room 2. Who's the reporter for room 2, please?
Yep, that's me. That's Emma. Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please, Emma.
Okay, so things that had surprised us in the workplace. Some quite positive things in terms of surprising ourselves at how agile some of the organisations we're connected with have been. Surprised at how behaviours that have maybe been resisted for quite some time, in terms of the example being needing to be physically in the same space as people, being told you can't do that anymore, but actually how quickly people have adapted, at least in these initial stages. Also within the workplace, seeing actually sometimes being surprised at the range of behaviours that are already being displayed, not making assumptions that within the organisation maybe everyone's a fighter, actually seeing a range of reactions, and finding that actually quite helpful to be able to understand each other a little bit more. And in the leadership styles as well, seeing a different range of leadership styles coming through. We also talked a little bit about, the world outside work as well, and in terms of just how recent weeks have maybe given people a chance to reflect on their own responses to the situation. Again, sometimes finding positive things about actually being surprised at the benefits of slowing down, having a bit more space to think, but equally being aware of some of the things that have maybe niggled and yet taken us by surprise, just little things that have maybe frustrated us. So yeah, those are the main things that we covered.
Brilliant. And if I could ask the reporters just to type into the chat room now so everybody can see it, that's great. If it was only in your chat room and your breakout room, the rest of us can't see it, I think, easily. But anyway, breakout room 3. Who was that? Anybody claim they were in breakout room 3?
I think we were, Alistair.
Yeah, that was yours, Alistair.
Okay, that's Chris then.
Okay, so I posted our room into chat. So I think I tried to capture around 3 areas. So one around leadership, both in supporting the staff, but also supporting decision makings. How do we make decisions when the environment is changing constantly? How are energy levels kept high when you've got no exit strategy? What are the right messages for staff? Is this a sprint or a marathon? And then there's a bunch of challenges with supporting staff. So the initial confidence of people working from home, but then niggles kicking in, and real struggles with isolation and mental health, and how we look after staff well-being, the practicalities of equipment, and how do we remain team while we're all remote. And then a flow of activity, but then actually not getting through our to-do lists, and how do we look after our business kind of key operations while also looking after staff, and making sure that people are coping with the change. And really helpful to hear from, sorry, I'm looking for your picture and your name.
Nicole.
Nicole joined us from Germany, who's 2 weeks ahead of the curve from us in terms of isolation. And yeah, really helpful to hear how this whole idea of whether this is a marathon or a short sprint, and keeping energy levels high, and how you work as a team, how you're going to do this for a longer term than you might have expected at the start. Yeah, is that okay?
That's brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And there's also a mixed messaging, I think, between organisations who've got lots of people who are still frontline service delivery and people who are home office based. So that's certainly the case in large bits of the NHS, as well as Border Force, for example, who are in our group. So, okay. Room 4. Who was the reporter for room 4? Anybody own up to being in room 4?
So it should either be Claire, James, John, Julia, Naomi, or Spencer in room 4.
I think
That's started off sounding, hasn't it?
Polite thing where we didn't actually nominate a reporter because our conversation was too good. But I shall take one for the team if that's okay. Similar to sort of the other groups, we had a blend of colleagues people from the NHS, independent consultants, myself at the bank, Spencer at the co-op. So a real dichotomy of frontline people keen to get stuck in and back office people desperate to help out the front line. We talked a bit about the programmes that had very quickly sort of sprung to life to pull together, and just the energy and inspiration that we're feeling in kind of coming together, and some shared experiences there.
Great, thank you. Thanks for stepping up. Breakout, last but not least, 5. Who's the reporter in 5?
That's me. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, if people go to speaker view, and then if you ask Nick at the top under view options to take control, you probably can't. Does that work, Nick?
Yeah, Nick, you have to stop sharing your screen so that I can share mine.
How do you go to speaker view? I'll ask the naive question.
Top right on my laptop, which isn't a fancy Mac like yours. Top right, it's got speaker view.
Okay, got it.
And that puts the speaker in the middle.
And can you guys see my screen now?
Yeah.
Super. Okay, so we got caught by surprise by one chap had an explosion in a Zoom meeting. An individual who just kind of went full rant. He described it as front to back brain, which made me think I need to do some research on that. It sounded really interesting, and arguing to his perception as the world as he sees it, rather than any real kind of response to the comments that were coming to him. And that, obviously it gave the person concerned a little bit of consideration as to how best to deal with that, and also, thinking about, do I need to consider an insurance, etc. On those sorts of things. People were surprised about what surfaces under pressure, and the polarization in that, from the extremely beautiful to the extremely dark. There was an assumption, particularly and it was in the education sector, that that people had a basic vocational drive to be there for children and families, whereas actually that in some of the initial response, what they saw was a withdrawing and a kind of self-focus. But the majority have prevailed, and they've been very positive and up for playing their part. From the NHS legal perspective, there were some comments about how good the IT had been to enable us to get on the front foot working from home. The response was very quick, but also a growing consciousness that some don't want to work from home or find it difficult to work from home for various reasons, and some moments of panic, but all of those were recovered well. I made a few comments that are not written down there from the BT perspective as well, in that we've been a little bit caught by surprise by just how fast things have changed, but our internal communications engine has been catching up fast with that, and also we've been able to turn around a system, in a couple of days really, to be able to allow us to log to a much greater degree of granularity where people are and what they're doing, so we understand the status of our workplace, and that we can exercise our duty of care that way as well. And somebody's requesting remote control of my screen, which I'm going to decline. And then the strategies that have worked well for us were around planning, anticipating the next things, lots of communicating by all sorts of different means, and Skype actually being able to see people was something that was very much appreciated as well. And for me, just kind of chipping in with kind of audio technology and things that I can do to help various different people, but also making sure that I keep doing the exercise. I happen to have a turbo trainer upstairs in the bedroom, which works fine for me. My wife is going out on bike rides, the kids are going out for runs. So doing those things to maintain the physical well-being that knocks onto the mental as well. And that's group 5.
Thanks very much, Phil. Yeah, well, and I think that's all the groups then. So thanks for sharing that. If you haven't already been able to, if you could either post in chat or send through to Nick your kind of reflections and feedback, that would be really really helpful. So what we're proposing now, a fascinating set of responses, is Roger's going to share, and myself will share a little bit about some of the thinking about resilience. And then we will give you a chance again in the groups to have a think. So one of the themes we'll talk about is improvisation, and we've already heard lots of that. So over to you, Roger.
Thanks, Alistair. Some of you might be, those of you who've worked with us might be familiar with some of this, but I think it's always valuable to have the reinforcement. So what we're going to do briefly is look through the theory and practice of resilience. I've gone too far. Right. So just exploring resilience and what is it? Resilience is an engineering term, which is about kind of bouncing back to the original shape. The CIPD and Institute for Occupational Safety and Health talk about it as the sense of adaptation, recovery, and bounce back despite adversity or change. Dynamic process involving a personal negotiation through life, fluctuating across time, life stage, and context, multidimensional, and a product of personality in combination with environmental influences such as family, peers, and social environment. The more we kind of now understand around the science of behavior, the more we understand about the almost equal power of environment over and personality, you know, kind of the genetic and the choices. Resilient, we like this particular model because it's quite a simple one that comes from Diane Kutu in HBR. Resilient people possess three characteristics: staunch acceptance of reality, a deep belief, often buttressed by strongly held values that life is meaningful, and an uncanny ability to improvise. And what Diane Kutu is saying in this is effectively you can kind of bounce back with one or two of those qualities, but real resilience requires all three at personal as well as at individual level. So we think there are these kind of three key thoughts in resilience. It is what it is. First of all, that's that staunch acceptance of reality. So the circumstances we're in are the circumstances we're in, however much we may dislike them. So it is what it is. But let's hold on to what's meaningful in life, meaningful in our work as the second key thought. The third key thought is about the ability to improvise. So how do I now get around this? And it was really interesting hearing that feedback from that first round about how quickly so many people have, and organizations have, improvised in the situations that they found themselves in. So that they're the kind of three key steps, three key thoughts that we build into the resilience model. And I'll hand over now to Alistair to talk about SCARF. Maybe just kind of, can you take me back a slide, Nick? Just a resumption before handing over to Alistair. Resilience, product of a person's behavioral preferences and personality, that sense that I can't control everything around me, but I am the only one who can control my reactions. Nobody else can control my reaction for me, only me. And we know a bit more now about from the neuroscience research findings about the plasticity of our brains, but that we've got some choice in how we think, including how we think about our personal agency. And I'm going to hand over now to Alistair to talk about personal agency and the SCARF model.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. So personal agency is a definition from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in the States. Have introduced a really useful thing called the Psychology of Change framework. And basically agency is an ability of an individual or group to choose to act with purpose, but you've got to have both that power, but you've also got to have the courage or the emotional resources to be able to respond. And at the moment, that's a key challenge for many people, is that ability to act. What we're seeing is huge action. I mean, I've worked with the NHS for 33 years. I have seen nothing like what I've seen in the last couple of weeks. The scale of change and shift happening, and that's true in many, many organisations, many, many sectors. Just that incredible, courage and ability to act collectively. It's amazing. So, but one of the things that we think is important for us to think through in that final bit that we're going to say before we go back to groups is, what are the needs that we've all got for working? I don't know who's familiar with this. This comes from work from David Rock in the Institute for the Neuro Leadership. And the SCARF model basically says each of us have got 5 needs that need to be addressed in work. And we will vary a bit as to which ones are most important for us. But to work well, we each need these. And I'll just go through them quickly, because one of the obvious things is, for many of us, the work's been turned, for many people, the organisation of work has been turned on its head, and therefore these will have changed. So one is status, by which we mean the kind of social position in relation to others. Am I seen as a cog in the machine? Am I seen as a colleague? Am I seen as somebody who's got something to really contribute? And it may or may not tie up with hierarchy, but status is one. Certainty, our ability to predict outcomes, what's happening. That is an issue for everybody, as we've been hearing about. We have no idea what's going to happen. One of our colleagues said the other day, actually just knowing that we're on lockdown for 3 weeks really helps me, because I now at least have 3 weeks of certainty, relatively speaking. So certainty. Autonomy, that sense of control over our destiny. Well, we've now got the ability to do work at home, and there's no boss over our shoulder, but actually we're not allowed to go out of the house except on limited conditions. So what's that doing to us? Relatedness. Are we part of an in-group or not? But actually, for many of us, that being in the same room as people is really important, or we're finding it's really important. And the final one is fairness. The F is fairness. Are we or others treated in a just and a fair way? So that's what the research evidence shows. We all need that for working together. So that's had a big change. So we thought, interesting questions for you to go into groups. We're going to go back into groups for, again, 20 minutes. I think there are some great examples about where you and your organisation has really had to improvise. And the second question we're suggesting is, those SCARF factors, and I'll post them for you into chat, those SCARF factors will have changed. And which ones are most been upset, and how might you help people? So again, same thing. Could you be ready to feedback to everybody? Everybody back?
Yep.
Yeah.
Breakout room 1 could go first this time. That would be great.
So things that we heard. One thing that came out of quite a lot of our discussion was actually people questioning how much they thought it was improvisation that they'd had to do a lot of, and relating that to those SCARF factors. So we scribbled down a few things there. People talked about innovation that had to come along with changes to routine in working practice, people adapting in their organizations to comms activity, people taking risks, and a question about in the SCARF analogy, whether status recognition was such an issue or not. Maybe that was more around hierarchy, and then putting things on pause. And questions about what was it all going to look like afterwards in ways of working, if we've become more agile. Is it fair because not everybody wants to work from home, perhaps? when we come out the other side of this. We've improvised because we're not flying so much, less waste, less carbon. What might that do to things? And people acknowledging family changes and working patterns changing and improvising in that environment and bringing disruption. So those are the things that we thought about in room 1.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ralph. He's available for hire, by the way, if you want anybody to capture you digitally a live meeting. He does a great job, and you may have spotted some of our graphics over the years from him. Anyway, breakout room 2. Yep,
that's me again, Emma.
Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, I'd love a workshop on how to do that. Digital capturing looks absolutely brilliant. So in terms of the improvisation, a lot of it is centered around, you know, making the shift to digitization, about using IT wherever we can. And we did take a brief moment to consider whether we should all stand on our doorsteps tonight and actually applaud the IT services as well, just to echo what was done for the NHS last night, because we're so dependent on that technology at the moment. And actually just listening to what Ralph was saying, we were also reflecting on the sort of short-term improvisation and the sort of already the major shift that's happened, but then beginning to say, well, but then how will that look in the longer term? What would we retain? What you know, at the moment we're just sort of celebrating the positives, but there are, you know, issues that will need to be worked through very carefully as well for the longer term impact of the improvisations that have come in. I think Ralph also alluded to this sort of intersection of the improvisations that are taking place in the workplace are actually very much intersecting with with our home lives as well. They're often, because we're working at home, there's an even greater sort of intersection of home and work than there might be for others normally. And then we reflected on the scarf things, and actually what came through, I think, from our discussions was that really whichever, you know, letter or letters you went for, the theme was about communication. Because if you felt that certainty was important, it was, well, how are we communicating with our clients so that we can try and just bring in a little bit of certainty about what's happening? If we're worried about our autonomy, are we letting people communicate how they're feeling? And similarly with the relatedness, are leaders, you know, communicating? Are they allowing their staff to communicate? So just, yeah, the importance of communicating throughout really shone through when we were looking at that discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Thanks. Chris, do you want to give us your quick highlights from breakout room 3?
Yeah. I was just going to paste them into the chat window. So I'm doing two things at once. Right. So there's been dramatic shifts in innovation, but maybe some have been left behind, whereas others have taken the bull by the horn and done some pretty incredible things. Maybe challenges facing those at the other end of the spectrum. How do we manage long-term uncertainty? And there needs to be a significant head shift for the organisation, just in terms of what will be the long-term changes required as a result of both the fact that we don't have an exit strategy or date when things might return to normality, but also in terms of that there might be long-term changes required for the organisation, and that's going to take a shift in our time and energy to work out what those will be. Someone mentioned in our group they've had to have a reverse organisational mentality, so they've had to set targets to reduce the level of users rather than increase them. Alistair mentioned he'd be optimistic that employers would trust their employees more and not feel they have to control them. And in the same vein was about, well, what opportunities are there to, Graham mentioned about merging what worked well of what we've done previously and what we're doing now. And is there some sort of happy medium where we can get more productivity or better results out of a mixture of what we've been through as this experience. And I think we talked a bit about when do we start thinking about what are the opportunities of this scenario. Some people are still in crisis mode, and it's too early to start talking about the opportunities for a change in strategy for the organisation. And so when is the right time to start to have those discussions?
Thanks, Chris. Group 4, do you want to give us your highlights? I'm we are going to finish, don't worry, at 5 or a couple of minutes after only. Don't worry, we're not going to overrun along. Group 4.
Yeah, me doing James, Group 4.
Hi, James.
Hi. So just very quickly, so we picked up the digital issue, and actually there was a suggestion that we shouldn't call it social distancing because the digital is bringing us together, but perhaps physical distancing as part of that. So that's just interesting. And then just seeing the issue about improvise in the NHS. Who would have thought NHS Nightingale Trust 4,000 beds in a conference centre and likely to replicate elsewhere. RBS using one of their facilities, I think it was conference facilities for a food bank. Supply chain issues and kind of supermarket changing their ranges. The NHS dual streaming supply changing now. Rapid improvement off the back of that. So really kind of big improvisation. So we kind of then didn't put scarf factors to them, but just recognise a large amount of improvisation coming in.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, for those of us on the NHS, I've never seen a hippopotamus dance quite like this ever. Thanks. Last but not least, 5. I see, Phil, you've gone ahead of us by posting it, but great.
Cool. Okay, so we were talking about that we were having to improvise daily. Zoom was a good chunk of it, and moving to workshops in bite-sized chunks, improvising in the technology. Some it was feeling like a liberation because there was not travelling to work, but others they actually felt chained to their laptop. And having to do catch-up work in the evenings. There was a suggestion about meetings from 05 to 55, so that there's a little bit of a 10-minute break between. Taking what we do and making it work. So this was a comment, I think it was from Lizzie, who was saying there's a lot of taking what we do and making it work virtually, but not yet very much about thinking about doing different things. And there was a conversation about asynchronous versus synchronous learning, which I think Lizzie had got a link to some development on, which might be interesting for people. In the early part of the lockdown especially, we noticed that we were clogging up each other's communications channels and needing to rewrite the rules on what we use for what. One of the people, in terms of the scarf factors, had 8 out of 10 people with symptoms, and so certainty about their future kind of took precedence over everything, and so relatedness plummeted. In education, polarised reactions at the macro level from initially confusing government advice, but they were eventually able to bring everybody together by initially getting them together in the same place, although that was controversial. It seemed to work, not during the lockdown, I hasten to add. For me, relatedness went massively up, and there was a bit of an overload of communications. All the things that everyone found really urgent were suddenly out of the window, and we wonder what that would be like when we get back to normality and how we pick up on major deadlines. And the thing about having to prepare for the return to normality now rather than waiting for that to happen, and what the recovery phase looks like, how you come out of this is just as important as how you go into it. And that was Group 5.
We'd love to carry on the conversation at the Tricordon. We think that's probably the easiest, a LinkedIn slide. We'll send you any slides we used. We'll send you a quick survey, and the next webinar will be that we're proposing in this series on the 3rd of April. At the moment, we're thinking the title is What Have We Learned About What's Working? So that's where it is. You may want to reflect on what does it look like for those in the front line. We've got a number of people there in that organisation, not just home working. And just what's all this doing to work and the organisation of work, which is what I think Phil started to get us going on there. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you ever so much for joining us. So safe weekends.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.